Hi folks, we are looking at solving quadratic equations today using factorization. So hopefully by the end of this video we should be able to solve quadratic equations using a common factor, difference of two squares, and using trinomials as well. Alright, so we need to be on top of our factorizing methods as well. If you are a little bit shaky on that, look back on the video, the flip learning video for factorizing. Okay, in terms of solving quadratic equations, if you do it without a graph, it is pretty much impossible, all right? So for instance, if I gave you x squared take away 2x take away 8 equals 0, right? And I said solve that, give me a value of x, all right? That essentially says what number, if you square it, take off twice that number and then take off another 8, gives you the answer of 0, all right? You would literally be there all day if you were going to do trial and error, okay? It takes far too long. So, like I've already mentioned in the learning intention, you need to factorise, okay? So that example that I've just talked about, the x squared take 2x take 8 equals 0, I'm going to use that as our first example. Okay, so for this first one, we're solving x squared take 2x take 8 is equal to 0. First things first, you need to make sure that on that right-hand side, that equation says equals 0, okay? Once you've got that, you can factorise. Remember, when you're factorising, top of the list is a common factor, next in the list is the difference of two squares, third in the list is a trinomial. If you look at that, x squared take 2x take 8 is equal to 0, there isn't a common factor, there isn't a number, a letter, or both that fits into each of those terms without leaving a remainder, so it can't be that. Next in the list is the difference of two squares. It's the difference of two squares, okay? Now, there's clearly more than two terms there, all right? So it can't be that one either, so it has to be trinomials that we're looking at. Now, when you factorise a trinomial, it doesn't matter how you were taught it in class, okay? It could be magic number, it could be sum and product, it could be the grid method, the table method, St Andrew's cross, or by looking at it, okay? It doesn't matter what method you use, all right? So when you factorise that trinomial, we're looking at x take 4, x take 2 is equal to 0. Now from there, if you read that sentence mathematically, that essentially says that this bracket multiplied by the second bracket is equal to 0, okay? Because remember there's an invisible multiplication sign in there. So if one bracket times another bracket is equal to 0, if the answer comes out to be 0 when you multiply them, then the first bracket has to be equal to 0, or the second bracket has to be equal to 0, or both brackets have to be equal to 0. So your next step is to make each bracket equal to 0. So you're going to have x take 4 equals 0, or x plus 2 is equal to 0, and from there just solve that very straightforward equation on the left and on the right to get your final answer for x. Okay, so on this first one, we've got x take 4 equals 0, add 4 to both sides, you've got x is equal to 4. On the right-hand equation, you've got x plus 2 is equal to 0, take 2 from both sides, left and right, you end up with x is equal to negative 2, all right? That is essentially it, okay? That's how you solve a quadratic equation. All right, now this will form part of a bigger subtopic in quadratics, okay? So you need to make sure that you can solve a quadratic quickly and successfully. Second example, we are looking at x squared take away 9 is equal to 0. All right, first things first, make sure that that is equal 0 on the right-hand side, which it is, which means we can factorise. Top of the list, common factor, there isn't one, okay? So there isn't a number, a letter, or both that fits into x squared and negative 9 without leaving a remainder. Next on the list is difference of two squares, difference of two squares, okay? So there's two terms there, which is good. It's a difference, which is a subtraction, also good. Make sure you double check whether or not both terms are perfect squares. X squared clearly is, and the 9 is one of your perfect squares, which is good. Okay, remember when you factorise difference of two squares, your two brackets are the same, except one's a plus, one's a takeaway. All right, all you need to do is square root the x squared, then square root the 9. So we've got x plus 3, x take 3, square root of x squared is x, square root of 9 is 3. Like I say, both brackets have to be identical other than the sign, one's a plus, one's a takeaway. Do not drop that equals 0 on the right-hand side. Same method as before, okay, bracket times a bracket equals 0, one bracket has to be 0, second bracket has to be 0, or both brackets have to be 0, which means you're going to have to make each one, pull it apart, equal to 0. So we've got x plus 3 is equal to 0, or x take 3 is equal to 0, and again, solve each equation separately. On the left, when you take 3 from both sides, you're going to have x is equal to negative 3. On the right, you're going to have x is equal to positive 3 when you add the 3 to both sides. Okay, that's quite a short one because obviously factorising with a difference of two squares is more straightforward and a little bit quicker than factorising a trinomial. Okay, let's take a look at this third one. So we've got solving x squared plus 10x is equal to 0. Okay, it's equal to 0 already, which means you can factorise from the off on this one. Top of the list is going to be a common factor, so you're looking for a variable, a number, or both that fits into both terms without leaving a remainder. So common to both of them is going to be x. So if I take x out as a common factor, okay, into the bracket has to go x plus 10. All right. So if you take out a common factor of x, x times what takes you back to x squared has to be x, x times what takes you back to 10x has to be 10. Okay. Now, normally at this point, you'd be saying one bracket times another bracket is equal to 0, one or other has to equal 0, or both have to equal 0. Now, the difference on this one is that there is only one bracket. That doesn't make much of a difference, though. Okay. I mean, if you wanted to, chuck a bracket around that first x on your highest common factor, okay? But you know that between the x and the bracket, there's an invisible multiplication sign, okay? So something times something else is going to give you 0, all right? But the same logic applies. So either this first term has to be equal to 0, or the second bracket has to be equal to 0, or both have to be equal to 0, okay? So set each bracket equal to 0. From there, you're going to have x equals 0, which is the highest common factor part, and then that bracket is going to be equal to 0 as well, so x plus 10 is equal to 0. That first one, I mean, you don't need to solve it. You've got a single variable equals a number. Again, it's fine that x is equal to 0. For the second one, all you need to do is take 10 from both sides, so you get x is equal to negative 10. Okay, on this one, the only reason why this one is tricky is because of the coefficient before x isn't 1. All right, so if you pause the video and have a go, okay, so remember step 1 is to make sure that it's that equation is equal to 0, which it is, okay, so you can definitely just factorise straight off on that one, okay, so can I get you to pause the video and then try that for me? Okay, so from here, if we are going to factorise, all right, top of the list was a common factor, second in the list is a difference of squares, and then third in the list has to be trinomials, all right? There isn't a common factor, there's definitely more than 2 terms, so it has to be your trinomials that we're looking at. So regardless of what method you use, you should have ended up with 3x take 1 bracket x plus 2 is equal to 0. Okay, sounding like a broken record, but if one bracket times another bracket is equal to 0, one bracket has to equal 0, the second bracket has to equal 0, or both brackets have to equal 0. So pull it apart. Okay, so we've got 3x take 1 is equal to 0, or x plus 2 is equal to 0. All right, and you just solve it as normal. Now, the first one's going to look a little bit weird, but that's okay. All right, if I add 1 to both sides, you end up with 3x is equal to 1. Divide through by 3, x is equal to 1/3. So it's fine that your answer comes out to be a fraction. On the right hand side, you get x plus 2 is equal to 0, take 2 from both sides, so x is equal to negative 2. Okay, so x equals 1/3, x equals negative 2 for your final answer on that one. So when you factorise a trinomial that's got a coefficient that's not 1, okay, it will get, I say tricky, okay, but it's not massively tricky. If, like I say, if you are needing a little bit of a recap on factorising, make sure that you check out the flipped learning video on that topic. Okay, let's take a look at this one. So we want to solve x squared take 3x is equal to 4. All right, so I've dropped back down to make the coefficient of x squared an invisible 1, which is fine. Okay, makes it a little bit more straightforward. However, step 1 said that you had to make sure that that quadratic equation was equal to 0. It's not. Okay, you got 4 on the right hand side. I need that to be 0. So all you're doing is taking that 4 to the other side of the equal sign. Okay. So you're going to have to rearrange that first of all right? When you take the 4, you end up with x squared take away 3x take away 4 is equal to 0, all right? You start at that same step again, all right? Make sure it's equal to 0, which it is, which means you know that you can factorise, okay? Top of the list is a common factor, there isn't one. Difference of 2 squares, there's more than 2 things, can't be that. So it has to be trinomials that we're looking at, okay? Like I say, I've made that coefficient an invisible 1, okay? Makes things a little bit more straightforward. When you do trinomials on that, regardless of what way you do it, you should end up with x plus 1, and then bracket x take 4 is equal to 0. Okay, here comes the broken record part. One bracket times another bracket is equal to 0. One bracket has to be 0, second bracket has to be equal to 0, or both brackets have to be equal to 0. Okay, so pull that apart at this point. You'll end up with x plus 1 is equal to 0, or x take 4 is equal to 0. Alright, and then solve each equation on both sides. So you end up with x is equal to -1. And on the right hand side, add 4 to both sides, you end up with x is equal to 4. Okay, this example, we've got 3x squared take away 2x is equal to 5x take away 3x squared plus 3. If anything, it's just annoying, okay? So remember, the first thing you're going to want to do is to get everything on to one side of that equal sign. It doesn't matter if it's on the left or on the right, okay? Just make sure it's all on the one side. Can I get you to pause the video, have a go at that? And I'll go over it in a wee second. Okay, so like I say, first thing you're going to want to do is to rearrange it so that it is equal to 0. All right, when you do that, so you're going to have to add the 3x squared to the left, take the 5x, take the 3. Okay, so you should end up with 6x squared, take 7x, take 3 is equal to 0. Okay, because it's equal to 0, you know that you can factorize. Top of the list, common factor, there isn't one. Second in the list, difference of 2 squared, there's definitely not 2 terms there. So it has to be trinomials that we're using. Again, regardless of what method you use, you should have ended up with 2x take 3, and then 3x plus 1 is equal to 0. Okay, at this point, okay, we should know that we're pulling apart those two brackets and setting them equal to 0. So you should end up with 2x take 3 is equal to 0, or 3x plus 1 is equal to 0. If we start on the left, solving on the left, I would add 3 to both sides. And then divide by 2 to get a single x on its own, you end up with x is equal to 3 over 2. On the right hand side, you're going to have 3x plus 1 is equal to 0. Okay, so you are going to take 1 from both sides, so you end up with 3x is equal to -1. And then to get x on its own, you are going to divide by 3. So you end up with x is equal to -1/3. Okay, so your two answers are x is equal to 3 over 2 and x is equal to -1/3. Okay, so that's pretty much a roundup of the different types of quadratic equations you might be asked to solve. All right, they do all involve some sort of factorization method. So again, make sure please that you do a refresh on factorizing if you're a little bit shaky on that. All right, there's lots of resources on the centralised Google Classroom for National 5. Make sure you pop on that for some extra practice questions.